yesterday's attacks and other things.
Some say that he does have ties to Muslim extremists. I don't know.
US troops are already heading home from Afghanistan, putting an end to a 2-decade-long war that saw as many as 100,000 American troops there. The withdrawal of the remaining few thousand is to be complete by the symbolic date of September 11, 2021. Now, the Taliban is advancing ahead of the drawdown. It has reached the gates of Kunduz, far from its traditional base in the south, seeking power in the country after 20 years. On April 14th, US President Joe Biden announced one of his biggest decisions since he came to office.
I'm now the 4th United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th.
Biden delivered his address in the White House Treaty Room, where George W. Bush announced the US-led attack on Afghanistan back in 2001.
We need to maneuver on them, or we need somebody else to maneuver on them.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
Between these two statements lie 20 years of war and terror. The chief US goal was to hunt down Osama bin Laden. The US had determined that bin Laden and his network were responsible for the September 11th attacks. But there was never a clear exit strategy, even after the Americans killed bin Laden in May 2011 in Pakistan. US combat operations officially began in early October 2001 with airstrikes against al-Qaeda training camps and Taliban military installations. From American air power and an anti-Taliban coalition of Afghans and tribal leaders, the Taliban government collapsed in December. The US flatly refused to negotiate with the toppled officials, sowing seeds for new waves of violence and terror. In the words of Afghanistan expert Ibrahim Bahis, once you have overthrown a force that was ruling over the country and replaced it with a disparate group of actors with diverging priorities and capabilities, seems like there really is very little choice other than to engage in some ways to keep the country from falling apart. The war the Americans staged in Afghanistan was, to a great degree, a serious attempt to undo what they had done in the heat of the Cold War. In the 1980s, the Americans trained, armed and financed assorted Afghan Arab groups who fought under the umbrella name of Mujahideen against the occupying Soviet forces. The Afghan Arab fighters later transformed into more distinguished groups, such as the Taliban and al-Qaeda. By the time Soviet forces retreated from the country in 1989, the Taliban had become a powerful group, and by 1996, they held power over roughly 3/4 of Afghanistan. In short, Washington's aim was to tame the creations of its policy that had run amok. But taming the group was easier said than done, costly, bloody, and almost impossible. Brown University's Costs of War also estimated that US military expenses in Afghanistan have exceeded $2.26 trillion. According to the UN Assistance Mission to Afghanistan, over the past 12 years, over 111,000 civilians have been killed or injured. Besides the Taliban, international troops have also killed many innocent civilians, especially when attacking villages with fighter jets and drones. The Afghans have had to bear the brunt of Washington's strategic mistakes and miscalculations. At the same time, the resurgent Taliban now control or contest more territory than at any time since the war began, ignoring calls for a ceasefire or at least a reduction in violence.
More than 50 of Afghanistan's 370 districts have fallen since the beginning of May. Most districts that have been taken surround provincial capitals, suggesting that the Taliban are positioning themselves to try and take these capitals once foreign forces are fully withdrawn.
Against such a backdrop, Biden's promise to leave Afghanistan for good, regardless of the conditions on the ground, has lessened the incentive for the Taliban to make concessions as the group sees itself the winner of the war.
ماندن اساکر چی امریکایی و چی ناتو بعد از مدت 14 ماه دوام اشغال در افغانستان است و ما در مقابل اشغال 20 سال مبارزه و جهاد کرده ایم. لذا در آن صورت ما مجبوراً مبارزه و جهاد خویش را ادامه میدهیم.
In other words, the Taliban have achieved one of their main goals, the unconditional withdrawal of international troops.
The administration decided to abandon U.S. efforts in Afghanistan, which have helped keep radical Islamic terrorism in check. And bizarrely, they've decided to do so by September the 11th. Apparently, we're to help our adversaries ring in the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks by gift wrapping and handing it right back to them. Unfortunately, this mistake in Afghanistan is one of several instances of this new administration surrendering leverage without making America, our allies, or our interests more secure.
Living in a time line where we are not anywhere with the negotiations, or we haven't received an agreement with the Taliban, would not be responsible, and it would can cost us losing everything we worked and fought together in the past 20 years, and that can risk overall security in Afghanistan. So that's why I think the extension is a responsible approach for what's happening here now in Afghanistan.
When the US invaded Afghanistan in October 2001, the country was an isolated, devastated country under the Taliban's control. 2 decades later, the country has not found peace and is marked with deep social and economic divisions. More than half of the population continues to live in abject poverty.
It's very naive to think that Americans came here to do anything with poverty, to do anything with peace building, to do anything with democracy or human rights. In fact, it's the other way around. The American presence, not in Afghanistan, but in the region and in the world, in the bigger picture, is more conflict, is to create more poverty, is to create more dependency to the United States.
The contested areas in the south and east of the country, the heartland of the Taliban, are in bad shape after bearing the brunt of Western firepower. Experts say escalating violence and the COVID-19 pandemic could push the poverty rate from nearly 50% to over 70%. Meanwhile, US intelligence agencies have concluded that the Afghan government could collapse within 6 months of the departure of the last international troops. US troops leaving Afghanistan seems to be more than a mere withdrawal. The Americans are in fact running away, shirking responsibility of cleaning up the mess they've left behind over the past 2 decades. In a war that has run for more than 20 years, longer than World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined, the US military in the end tasted humility while leaving the Afghans all to their own devices.
But we don't have a good history of taking care of those who sided with us in conflict and making sure that if they feel they cannot sustain themselves in their country or unwilling to do so, that we take care of them. And that sends a global message. Don't fight with the Americans, because when they're finished, they leave you behind. That's not something we can tolerate.
Will Afghanistan go back to square one when the Taliban were in power? And if so, who is to be blamed?